There are two fights happening every time an MMA card goes live. The one inside the octagon, and the one that's been running for weeks in your head, built entirely from press conference clips, social media callouts, heated stare-downs, and whatever Dana White said into a camera that morning with his collar popped and his arms crossed. The UFC is, first and foremost, a media company. It sells combat sports. But what it actually excels at, what separates it from every other combat sports organization on Earth, is narrative management. The construction of stories that make you feel something before a punch is thrown, and that keep you talking long after the final bell. The question nobody in mainstream sports coverage asks loudly enough is, when does narrative management become manipulation? And how much of what you believe about MMA is actually constructed for you by people with a very specific financial interest in what you believe? The fighter. Pay context. Before the stories make sense, you need the financial context. In the NFL, players collectively receive approximately 48% of league revenue. In the NBA, it's around 50%. These figures were fought for over decades through collective bargaining, player associations, and sustained organizational pressure that produced enforceable contracts. In the UFC, fighters are estimated to receive somewhere between 15 and 20% of total revenue, depending on whose accounting methodology you trust. The UFC disputes the lower end of those estimates, but has never published audited figures that would settle the question definitively. In 2014, a group of former UFC fighters, including Kung Lei and John Fitch, filed a class-action antitrust lawsuit, Lee versus Zoffa, alleging that the UFC had used its dominant market position to suppress fighter wages and restrict their ability to compete in other promotions. That lawsuit progressed through the courts for years and illuminated the degree to which the UFC's business practices had been structured around maintaining contractual control over the fighters who generate its value. The point is directional, not precise. UFC fighters are paid substantially less as a share of the revenue they generate than athletes in any of the major North American professional leagues. This matters for the narrative conversation because it creates the conditions where the story being sold to you isn't incidental to the business. It is the business. The UFC's model depends on getting viewers to care so intensely about specific fighters and specific matchups that they will pay for events, subscribe to ESPN+, and generate the kind of cultural conversation that drives the brand without requiring the UFC to pay the people at the center of it more than the minimum necessary to keep them. A fighter who believes in the beef, performs the beef authentically, and draws the audience through the beef is worth far more to the UFC than a technically superior fighter who gives flat press conferences. The narrative is the monetization vehicle. Conor McGregor and the template. The clearest case study in UFC narrative manufacturing is Conor McGregor, and acknowledging this does not require dismissing his genuine talent. He is a legitimately exceptional fighter. He is also a product, deliberately cultivated and amplified, in ways that the UFC's own promotional machinery made possible at a specific moment when the organization needed a new star. McGregor arrived in the UFC in 2013. The promotion of his fights was aggressive and targeted in a way that was new. His press conference performances, the suits, the accent, the specific language around rags to riches and I am the future, were amplified through UFC social media at a scale that other fighters' comparable performances simply were not. When McGregor said something quotable, the UFC clipped it and distributed it. When other fighters said things equally quotable, the clips didn't always travel the same way. The Red Panty Night speech before the first Jose Aldo fight, McGregor telling Aldo that he was going to send him and his wife on a celebration they'd never forget, became one of the most shared fight promotion clips of the decade. The UFC's promotional team understood exactly what they had and deployed it accordingly. Then Aldo was knocked out in 13 seconds. The greatest knockout in UFC featherweight history, in terms of the story it told, because the narrative build had been so extensive that the conclusion was the most dramatic possible version of itself. The UFC needed McGregor to keep winning, kept him winning by managing his matchmaking carefully, and when he lost to Nate Diaz, in a fight made on 11 days' notice at a weight class McGregor had never competed in, the rematch was framed not as McGregor being exposed, but as the next chapter of his story. He won the rematch. The narrative continued. Jon Jones and selective accountability. If the UFC's narrative management worked only to protect the fighters it needed, Jon Jones is the clearest evidence. Jones has been, by most technical assessments, the greatest light heavyweight in UFC history. He is also a fighter who has failed drug tests, been charged with hit and run leaving a scene after injuring a pregnant woman, faced further legal issues, and returned from suspension multiple times to continue headlining UFC cards. At various points, the UFC suspended fighters for social media posts, suspended fighters for refusing fights, and applied what appeared to be inconsistent standards for conduct violations. Jones, meanwhile, was repeatedly returned to the main event because the promotional value he generates is significant enough that the accountability calculus operates differently. The UFC's statement around each Jones controversy followed a pattern. Acknowledge the situation, express appropriate concern, allow the legal and regulatory processes to proceed, and then, when those processes concluded with conditions Jones could satisfy, book the fight. The narrative framing was always that Jones had served his time, learned from his mistakes, and was ready to compete. Whether any of that was true is genuinely unknowable from the outside. What is observable is the pattern of decisions, and what those decisions reveal about which values are actually primary. The manufacturing of hatred. The most commercially successful rivalries in UFC history share a structural feature. They are built around identities, not just athletes. McGregor versus Khabib Nurmagomedov was not just two undefeated fighters competing for a title. It was constructed as a civilization-level conflict between McGregor's Celtic loudmouth persona and Khabib's devout, reserved, undefeated Dagestani identity. The press conferences played on religion, nationality, and family in ways that generated genuine, deep emotion in audiences across multiple countries. When McGregor's team threw a dolly through a bus window in Brooklyn in April 2018, an event that injured several fighters and staff and resulted in criminal charges, the UFC's response was to strip McGregor of his lightweight title, announce criminal proceedings, and then book the fight for October 2018. It became the most purchased UFC pay-per-view in history at the time of its release. The criminal incident became promotional material. The UFC did not create the incident, but the decision to respond to an attack on fighters with a blockbuster pay-per-view 4 months later reveals how the organization processes events that, in any other context, would be treated as a serious organizational crisis rather than a marketing opportunity. What you're actually buying. None of this means the fights aren't real. They are. None of this means the athletes aren't legitimately skilled. They are. The violence is genuine. The preparation is genuine. The outcomes, with rare documented exceptions, are genuine. What is constructed is the meaning around the fights. The stories that tell you why this specific matchup matters, why you should care about these specific people, and what kind of person you are for caring about the specific fighter you're behind. The UFC is one of the best narrative machines in the history of sports entertainment. It is not the WWE, the outcomes aren't scripted. But the path from two fighters existing in the world to those two fighters selling out an arena was paved by decisions about amplification, matchmaking, scheduling, media access, and press conference management that were made by people who are very good at their jobs. You are allowed to love the sport while understanding the business. In fact, understanding the business is what makes you a more accurate reader of everything the sport presents to you as natural, organic, and real. Most of it isn't any of those things. It's a story, a very good one. Subscribe if you want to read it with the lights on.